Hi everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and today on our show is Peter Heller. Peter is a writer of high adventure into the wilder corners of the earth and the human spirit. A New York Times best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction, and an award-winning journalist, Peter's also been an NPR contributor. He's also explored the world aboard an Echo pirate ship as a bush pilot, a surfer, and a whitewater kayaker. So he's going to share some stories with us today. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
Great to see you.
It's good to be here.
I think we are so lucky to have you here because you live in Colorado and you just happen to be visiting relatives. You spent a lot of time in the area.
Yeah, I probably spent, better part of a decade on and off. 3 years of high school in Putney, and then 10 years on and off between Brattleboro, Putney, and Hanover, Norwich, Lyme, and there. Yeah.
Right. And but you're born in New York City, born and raised in New York City. And so coming to Vermont, what was that like for you as a kid?
Oh, I was so happy. I begged my parents to send me. So I have all this family in Putney, and I begged my parents to send me away to school when I was 15. It's just get me the heck out of New York City. I loved mountains and rivers and canoeing and climbing, and so it was good. Yeah.
How did you get to love it? Was it just coming to Vermont, or did you go to camp somewhere?
Yeah. We came to Vermont a lot to visit relatives, and then I went 5 years to a camp in the Adirondacks when I was pretty little, and it was pretty rigorous, and I loved it.
Yeah.
When I first got to Putney when I was 15, I did a project where I went into the woods with no food, no shelter. In early May, it was freezing and raining. I think I lost 13 pounds in a week.
Wow.
I was supposed to be foraging, but mostly I just, boiled up a few burdock roots and that was it.
But that was your idea, it was a project.
Yeah. I lived in a teepee, I hand sewed a Sioux teepee, and I lived in it for a year, going to school.
Really, when you were in high school?
Through a tough winter. It was minus 30 a lot at night that winter.
And this was in Putney?
Yeah.
And you were by yourself in the teepee?
Well, I did it because I was in love with a girlfriend. We weren't allowed to.
There you go.
Anyway, yep.
There's always a really good impetus for the things we do, right?
Yeah.
Your nonfiction writing is so much risk-taking is involved. There's so much high adventure, really, and you've done a lot of environmental writing and advocacy writing as well for Outside Magazine, Men's Health,
Men's Journal.
Yep, and Nat Geo.
Nat Geo, yeah.
Yes, you started writing nonfiction. You started with nonfiction, right?
I started writing poetry when I was 6. My dad used to read to me every night before I went to sleep, and he had me on E.E. Cummings when I was like 6 years old, which is sort of grounds for social services if you think about it. I mean, they're pretty bawdy, but I didn't understand them, but I loved the music and the language, and he was reading Yeats to me when I was like 11. So I wanted to be a poet coming up. And then I was walking around my little library in Brooklyn, and the librarian, Annie Bosworth, had a big crush on her, and I would have married her right then. Just for how she said my name. She said, Pita, she was British. And she said, are you looking for something to read? And I said, pound. And like a great, any great librarian or bookseller that's followed your reading since you were tiny, which she had, she knew what I was ready for, and she took me over to the fiction shelf and pulled off In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway, a little slim book of short stories, mostly Nick Adams stories about Upper Michigan. And you got to picture an 11-year-old kid bringing that home and opening it up in the middle of New York City, and my heart leapt out of my chest. I was just like, I want to do that. I want to hop off a slow-moving freight train with a rucksack and make a camp by the Big Two-Hearted River and fish for those gorgeous trout and not burn my tongue on the coffee the way Nick didn't burn his tongue on the campfire coffee. But mostly I just wanted to write like that guy because it just was the first time I'd experienced prose going through my skin right to my heart, sort of bypass the head.
Yeah.
And so from then on, I wanted to be a poet and a fiction writer like Hemingway. And I did everything I thought I needed to do. I would read the dictionary. I was 12 years old, and I would just make lists of words that I didn't know. And copy out poems and short stories that I love, just to feel the cadence going through my fingers, you know. So that's how it started.
So poetry, starting with poetry.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's music as well, really, right? It was the musicality of it, or the lyricism.
Yeah, and that stayed with me. I mean, when I write fiction now, I start with the first line, whose music that I love.
Yeah.
And I just follow, the story kind of rides the back of the language. I follow the music of that line into the next and the next, and I never know what I'm writing about until I get into it. So I was 12, I wanted to be a great writer, then I went to college, and I was an English major. I also studied biology because I thought I better know the difference between a spruce and a pine if I'm going to write about wilderness, which I knew I wanted to do. I got out of college, and they didn't tell us at the English department that you can't make a living being a poet or a short story writer.
Too bad.
It's kind of mean of them. But I got, I had every job for a while, and then I started writing, being a journalist to make a living. And I did that for years, and the thing about it was, all those stories, I knew the ending because it happened. I knew what was going to happen next because it happened. And so when I finally got to sit down and write fiction, it was like, I don't want to know. I want it to be like a river expedition. I'd come up loving to paddle, to kayak, and I did a lot of expeditions. And one thing I loved about that is if you're running a river that you've never been on or it's never been described, you come around a tight bend and you don't know what's going to be there. It could be, a cougar drinking, or a flight of swallows backlit, or whatever. I wanted that feeling of being on a narrative current, going into territory that I'd never been in before, and being surprised and shocked and thrilled. And so I remember I was writing the Dog Stars in my coffee shop, and I would just burst into tears. Something would happen and it would just shock me, and I'd have like tears dripping on the table. And I know everyone in the coffee shop was thinking, that poor son of a bitch is like going through a bad divorce or whatever, but really I was just transported and thrilled.
So is that part of it as well, is really being transported, going into the unknown of some kind?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like that writing, I write 1,000 words every day, and I usually write about 7 days a week when I'm on a novel. And it's the best part of my day. I mean, or of my life, because it's almost like being reincarnated somehow. Like you're living this completely other life. It feels real to me. A dog, Jasper, that was from the Dog Stars, he lives in my heart like a dog that I've had, and I still grieve. Yeah, which is interesting.
It's very interesting, and I know a lot of authors talk about sort of channeling their characters and that kind of thing. I think one thing that's interesting about how you describe it is that it's a little bit different. It's very sensory, and it's very much a part of your bones when you're writing it, and when you're writing and experiencing it at the same time.
Yeah.
Peter, with the many adventures and all of the kind of explorations that you've done physically, for real, not on paper, did you do training of any kind, wilderness training?
I ate a lot of ibuprofen, more and more as I get older.
Yeah.
I always did. I mean, if it was a whitewater expedition, I would go paddle a lot of local rivers, and I would train and do flat water and all sorts of stuff. And but I don't know, some of the stuff you just couldn't train for. Like when I went with Sea Shepherd to Antarctica, they're the eco pirate group. Mm-hmm. And I got a story assignment from National Geographic Adventure. I'd met Paul Watson, the captain and the head of Sea Shepherd, at Telluride at a film festival. And he stuck out his hand and he said, first thing he said was, "I've sunk half the Spanish whaling fleet and half the Norwegian." And no one had ever said that to me before. So then he invited me to come with him on his next campaign, which was to the ice edge of Antarctica, to try and disrupt the Japanese whaling fleet, who were whaling illegally down there, taking like 960 minke whales. And so he invited me to come, and I thought, this is going to be really fun and cool and exciting. And I kind of treated it like, a kayak expedition or something. And I brought a bunch of fishing gear. I thought, we're going 9 knots in the Southern Ocean, could be good fishing. unbeknownst to me, I had my little duffel bag. I got onto the pier, onto the dock at Victoria Docks in Melbourne, and it's sort of prosperous with cafes and restaurants. And there was this all-black pirate ship tied up to the dock with flying a Jolly Roger and menacing-looking warship. And I kind of went, oh. And I walked up to the superstructure, which is the part that sticks up that has the bridge on top. Mm-hmm. And there were rows of skulls and crossbones.
Oh my God.
With the names of ships, the Marild, Isba 1, Isba 2. And these were all ships that these guys had rammed on the high seas or sunk. And I started to think, oh, I'm getting in deeper than I thought. Then a Hell's Angel tattoo artist from Amsterdam showed me my birth. And he was an animal rights guy. And he said, by the way, you have to sleep in your clothes because when the Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace's ship, was sunk by the French commandos, a photographer died because he couldn't get out fast enough. And so you have to sleep in your clothes. And then I was like, and he said, by the way, it's a vegan ship. So I took the fishing gear and I just like hid it under him.
That's wild.
But anyway, those guys were, and then, a few days out, on the high seas, all the welders came on deck and welded a huge blade to the bow they called the can opener. It was like a triple reinforced steel sharp blade for gutting the hulls of ships. And then I knew, this was no lark, it was like totally serious,
Very serious, so. And you were writing.
Yeah, I had an assignment from National Geographic Adventure, and they were really leery about it. It took a while to convince them. I had a great editor that I'd followed through different magazines who convinced them that this would be good, but they didn't want to glorify eco-terrorism, mm-hmm. which is what some people think, when they think of these guys. And they thought their writer might go native, and of course I did.
That's another story, right?
But yeah, so I had the assignment, but I had a letter. They made, the National Geographic Society made Watson and me sign a letter saying I was a non-participant. Mm. I was a journalist and I had that thing laminated.
I'll bet
and
you did.
And I stuck it in my dry suit because I thought, if we get sunk, which we almost did by the Japanese factory ship, when I'm in the water waving for help, I can pull out this letter, right?
Wow. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
What a story. And I know that's only one of many stories that you've got like that, of that kind of tension and warrior spirit.
But what was so cool was they had such a sense of fun on the ship. I think they realized, they knew more about the crisis of the oceans, right, and the unraveling ecosphere than anyone. I mean, they had biologists on the ship, mm-hmm. marine biologists, they mm-hmm. had environmental filmmakers, and yet at the same time, they had this. I think they realized if you're not going to sink into total despair about all this, you have to have a sense of fun, and they catapulted garbage onto they had a catapult that they put organic garbage in and, catapulted onto the ships. They would blare from these huge speakers, the Ride of the Valkyrie, the Apocalypse Now, and it scared, the enemy, they freaked, it's like, but they had a great sense of fun.
You all got out alive.
Yeah, everybody lived. Thank God. Thank you.
Oh man, I bet you've been kissing the ground in more than one spot, right?
Yeah.
That's incredible, Peter. So you make a shift at some point to writing fiction.
I went to Iowa Writers Workshop when I was like 32, mm-hmm. Because I was already making a living as a writer, writing for magazines, and I just thought. I'm writing these sort of stories that, I'm getting paid per word, and I'm writing for these adventure packages or environmental stories, and I thought, this is a little bit getting away from my original intention, which was to write poems, mm-hmm. and I kind of wanted to be around, 50 other people that thought poetry was the most important thing in the world, know. So I went to Iowa, and I studied poetry and fiction there. Yeah. And it was marvelous. It was so wonderful.
You had a couple of great mentors as well.
Yeah, I had Jory Graham was my poetry mentor, and yeah, Marilyn Robinson was my fiction mentor,
Yeah.
which she was amazing.
Yeah, well, those are two authors that I've always held in very high esteem,
Yeah.
as well as Wallace Stegner, who you did name one of your characters after.
Yeah.
Or you used his
I didn't
name.
mean to.
You didn't? No? He just came in?
Well, I made, so the painter in the painter is Jim Wagner,
Yes.
and I called him Jim Stegner because
Yeah.
it sort of sounded the same and had this, Western sort of
Yeah.
flavor to it. But then I thought, how, perfect, because he's one of my favorite writers, and it was a sort of a tip of the hat to.
Yeah, that's a nice way to do it.
Yeah.
Which you've done in your fiction, straight through almost all of your fiction, right? There
Yeah.
are a lot of Putney names that come up in.
Those are all real classmates and stuff.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, that's always fun. I mean, it's fun for us locally, of course, to read those names and to make that connection.
I haven't been sued yet.
Yeah,
That's good.
It's a good thing. That's a real good thing. Yeah, in The Painter, you mentioned Eric Aho, and you actually consulted with him a bit on that, I think, too. Did you?
I probably did. I talked to Eric. I'm probably going to see him on Monday. He's one of my very favorite painters. I think he's a genius, and one of the great American landscape painters.
The way you go about writing, the whole thing about the first line and just going, you don't plot it out like a lot of, I assume, especially mystery writers would do, and going with it.
Whoa, wait a sec. This
Yeah.
is really interesting. So, when I sat down to write my first novel, as I said, I didn't want a plot. I didn't want an outline because I wanted to be surprised, right?
Right.
And I wanted it to unfold like an expedition into wild country. So, I didn't know if it was legal to start with the first line and not have any clue. I mean, would the fiction police like bang down your door? It's like, does anybody do this? So so my best friend at Putney School was this guy Carlton Hughes, and he is a brilliant TV producer and showrunner. So he was the showrunner for Lost. He's the one who wrote the ending. If you didn't like the ending in Lost, send him a letter. But he did Jack Ryan. He has, I think, 3 shows on TV. I mean, he's big. And but he was just another kid in high school. And I called him up and I said, "Hey, Carltoni, you've worked with a lot of novelists. Do you know anyone who just starts with their first line and doesn't have a clue?" And he didn't hesitate. He said, "Oh yeah, I've worked with Stephen King. He often starts with the first line. He has no idea the first line is a voice.
Yeah.
The voice is a character. Character's in a place. There's a situation because there's always a situation. He writes into the story." Right. And then he said something that really surprised me. He said, "I've worked with Elmore Leonard and talk about, mystery plot, tightly plotted mysteries, Get Shorty and all that." And he said he often starts with the first line, just, has no idea.
Yeah.
So it gave me permission,
Yeah.
and I just, when I sat down to write my first novel, I kind of closed my eyes and I kind of listened. I'm a very oral, writer. And I wrote, I keep the beast running. I keep the low lead on tap, which is 100 low lead on tap, which is aviation fuel. I foresee attacks a few lines later. My name is Hig, one name, Big Hig if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream, and I'm not saying I did, it's because the trout are gone, every one. And as soon as I wrote that, I had no idea where this guy was, who was talking, but I just thought, I'm listening.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just sort of, I shut my eyes and I listened, and then it was as if this guy was on the other side of a campfire on an October night with the wind blowing the flames around. He was sort of telling me what had happened to him a few years before, and it was the most thrilling thing I'd ever experienced.
Wow. And which book was this?
That was The Dog Stars.
That was the beginning. That was the beginning of your fiction writing.
And then a couple of pages in, I realized it was post-apocalyptic, and I was kind of like, crap, I don't want to write a post-apocalyptic story, but the voice was so, I thought, well, this will get compared to Cormac McCarthy if it gets published, The Road, and you don't want to get compared to Cormac McCarthy on your debut novel, but the voice was so compelling, I just kept going.
And you did really well with that book as well.
I love that book.
Yeah.
Still do.
One of the things about your fiction that I know, it feels so cinematic. Have anybody ever approached you about movies?
Almost all of them are under development.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
The guy who wrote The Revenant, which I think is just a fantastic film. DiCaprio, he was the Mountain Man, based on Hugh Glass's story. But anyway, the guy who wrote that just finished the script for the Dog Stars.
That's so exciting.
And it's really good. Yeah.
That's very exciting, Peter.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
yeah. So that's good. And then the guy who did Longmire is writing the pilot for Celine. He called me and he said, I just spent 7 years doing a show based on my father, which was Longmire. I want to do one about my mom. And I said, well, Celine is my mom, like as written.
Let's talk about Celine a little bit, because your mom, your dad was a writer, and your mom was an artist and sculptor, but also a private investigator.
Right.
Yeah.
So Mom wanted to be I think she wanted to be in the CIA when she was little. Well, she wanted to be James Bond. She came over from France when she was 7. Her dad was American, but he was when the Germans marched in, she was 7 and they had to leave. And so she came to New York speaking only French, and she would go around Manhattan listening to conversations trying to decide who was a Nazi spy at 7. I mean, and I don't know if James Bond was around yet. I don't think so, but I guess she wanted to be in the French Resistance as a little kid. And then she wanted to be James Bond, and then I came along. She had me when she was 24, and that kind of ruined that part. Maybe, but I don't know. I'll talk about that in a second. But after she had the 3 of us, she went and got her PI license. And like a week after she got it, the FBI called. And they said, hey, we're trying to track down this guy who perpetrated a large bank fraud on the Bank of New York. And I guess time was running out. And so they said, we think he's around Greenwich, Darien, but we don't really have an agent who can kind of, sort of mix in that crowd. And maybe you could, and could you help us? So she said, yeah, sure, of course. So she made some phone calls, and she found out like her aunt had played tennis with his aunt at Woodstock, right? One of those kind of things. And she said, she called up the aunt and said, I have his dog tags from the 10th Mountain Division. I'd love to return them. And she was all a titter. And she said, oh, I had one of those, affairs too when I was younger. And, and she gave her the address, and she went in her old Volvo, and she spied on this guy. It was like a horse property, the white fences and the big stone house, And she spied on him with her opera glasses. And then he gets in his like little Mercedes sports coupe and drives away on the gravel road, and they had a car chase. And when I heard about it, it sounded like they were on 2 wheels, but they were probably going 40. But anyway, eventually he could not lose my mother. And eventually I think he just saw this little well-coiffed head barely seeing over the steering wheel. She's really petite. And he just pulled over. And Mom opened the door, and clack, clack, clack went the pumps, and jingle went the bangles. And he rolled down his window, and she said, Franklin, what you're doing is wrong. And it's not good for you, it's not good for your family, and you've got to make this right. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to follow you back to your house, and then we're going to both drive together to the Bank of New York, and we'll settle this thing. And her sort of sense of moral authority was so strong that he just did. And she said that when they put the cuffs on him, because the special agents were waiting there, he looked so crestfallen and pathetic that she never wanted to do perps again. Oh. So she didn't. Yeah. I think she only did one other perp case. But what she did was reunite. She and her husband, her second husband, Pete, were a team, an investigative team, and they reunited birth families. And the cold cases from 20, 30 years before, they would.
So that's true. That's part of Celine's
story. Yeah. They
well.
Found over 100 children and parents.
Amazing.
And reunited them. Yeah.
Wow, you did an amazing job of weaving that all into Celine.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, what a character.
Oh, and she was a combat pistol shooter. I mean, my mom. Really? That scene where she like hits all the cans, and the guy in the gun shop is just like. That's true.
Who would you choose to play her?
God, I have no idea. I thought Glenn Close would have been great. But what was the movie about the Nobel Prize winner where Glenn Close was the wife who actually did the work? Do you remember that movie? I can't remember.
Oh, yes, I do. I do.
Maybe it was called.
He got all the credit for it. It was the wife. It was something.
The wife.
Yeah.
She was so great in that.
She was so great in
and
that.
I just thought, when I saw that, I thought she could play my mom.
Yeah, she might be able
Probably,
to. Yeah. That's exciting. You know, one of the things in your books too is that, which I really notice a lot, and I know that you talk about, is that you do some dark subjects. You know, you go down the path of loss and dark things, but not doomed, and that's something that I really feel. You know, you're really looking into how humans address their frailties and what they do, like your mother. You know, just the moral compass and all of that stuff. But I have been so sort of touched by that fact of your relationship with being a human being and sort of investigating. And trying to untease things in the human psyche.
Oh, I appreciate that. You know, someone said just the other day that they loved Celine because they were such unlikely heroes because my mother could barely walk. You know, they were doing this. You know, this Celine's investigating this missing person up in Montana, and you know, she's on oxygen sometimes because of COPD, emphysema, and you know. Sometimes she has to walk very slowly, and you know, they're just an old couple, but she's packing a Glock under her bathrobe, and she's a badass, and she can talk a Hell's Angel down from doing bad things, you know, just by being her. And
well, the guide too, you know, I mean, there's some very dark things in that, you know, and at the same time, like I said, you know, a lot of it is this, I think, an amazing balance between your intuition and the craft, you know, that you've honed over all of these years, as well as the human capacity for good and evil.
Yeah. I think, you know, I think about my body of work, and you know, The Dog Stars was about a guy living at a little country airport 9 years after a super flu that killed almost everything, and he only has his old dog Jasper. His wife, you know, had she died pregnant with her first child, and so this is a man who lost everything. And the whole book is really about, you know, what do you risk to love again? You know, how much will you risk? And because you're gonna lose. We all, you know, if we get connected with others and with the planet, we're gonna lose everything in the end, of course. And so, you know, how much do you risk, you know, to connect and love? And I think that theme is in a way in all the books when I think about it. You know, it's like.
And is that the same kind of risk that you take on a river, or that you take being out on an echo ship?
I think only in that it's about engaging. I mean, I think you could. It's not so much risk. It's like how vulnerable are we willing to be? And we can be vulnerable in our own gardens. You know, we can be vulnerable to the beauty around us, and the cycle of life, and the loss that entails, and the wonder. And I think everywhere we go, it's like, how engaged do we want to be? How open do we want to be? It's scary. Being open.
And you never know what's going to come next.
Right.
Yeah, which is true of your stories as well.
When I finished The Dog Stars, I really loved it. And I thought, this is pretty good. And I thought, maybe when it gets published, people will respond. One way or another, people are going to respond. And I thought, that's going to create pressure. I've heard of second novel syndrome, the sophomore effort, how much pressure it can be. I didn't want to do that. So I thought, I've got 9 months until it's published. Maybe I can write the next novel mostly in that 9 months. So I went right to work on the painter. And in The Dog Stars, my first novel, I would go to the coffee shop and I would sit down and I would close my eyes and I would say to myself, don't think, just listen. And it's sort of like, get out of the way and just let Hig talk. And so I started writing the painter, and I started to think about it. Like, okay, he kills this guy with a rock who's beating a horse, and he saves the horse. This isn't giving anything away because it's all in the first few pages. But so now, should the guy have a brother who's bent on vengeance, the victim? So I called my editor in New York, Jenny, and I said, well, should he have a brother? And she said, oh yeah, of course. I wrote the brother. And then I started thinking, well, now should the brother chase him to Santa Fe when he goes to do the commission to paint these girls and these twins? He had this commission. Should the brother try and kill him? And then I started thinking, I'm thinking about it. That can't be good, because I didn't think about the last one. So I was sort of in this creative, moil. And I was in Paonia, Colorado, tiny little town in western Colorado where the painter takes place. And I was in the very little coffee shop where he actually meets his model in the book. And it's about as big as this little dais here. It's tiny, and there's one table in the middle. You're going to talk to anyone who's in there. Guess who was in there? Paolo Bacigalupi, the great science fiction writer. He's he's won Andromeda Awards, Hugo Awards. He wrote The Wind-Up Girl. He's amazing writer. Anyway, we got to talking, and I told him about this creative struggle I was in. And he's a lot younger than me, but he picked up his coffee cup, and he said, "Sit down, son. I got to tell you a story." And he said, "I wrote 2 short stories. First one, I was total fugue state. I kind of woke up. It was done. I sent it in. It won a big award. I love it. Second one, I plotted every second of the story. I engineered the characters to interact in a certain way in every scene. Total authorial control. I sent it in. It won a big award, and I love it. And now when I hold them both up, I love them both, and I can't tell the difference." And he leaned forward and he said, "Your job is just to make sure it doesn't suck." And the creative burden just sort of lifted off my shoulders. I thought, well, that's something I probably can handle. But what he was really saying was, don't sweat the method. You have revision. In revision, you can move stuff around. You can take out the slow stuff, do what you need to do, and don't sweat it. Rely on your craft. But he was also saying, every story could have a different method. Sometimes you can plot it. You can loosely block it out. You can just seat of the pants, let it rip.
Right. It changes as you change,
Yeah.
too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You did say that you hope to write more books that will break the universe open for the reader.
Yeah, and that means it breaks it open for me.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm sort of, it's not quite this feeling of epiphany. It's sort of like if I'm completely alive and awake and have a sense of awe when I'm writing, then it has a chance of having that for the reader.
Well, that's what you're compelled by as well, right?
Yeah.
That curiosity and that level of energy,
Right.
Which comes across in the writing.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, but in ways that I find really interesting, because I think that it's so balanced with the poetry, with the lyrical part. That you've got these high-speed chases that are crazy up at the mountains. That was a wild car chase. And then you've got this poetry on the other side of it. Beautiful lines that really are they're very moving.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I almost care about the sound of it more than anything.
Yeah, right.
The lyricism and the cadence.
Right.
But it's really fun, but I get transported, with these people in high pressure situations, and I get excited.
Yeah, but it's both of those together.
Yeah,
that's so
right.
wonderful about the writing, because there was a great book, or a great quote. Someone said, "Speed up for the crime solving, slow down for the zen."
For the Zen, that's very nice of whoever wrote that.
I'll find out who wrote it and let you know. That also kind of brings us to, I know you've got a new book coming out. You've also got a new story about poetry, which also has some southern Vermont in it.
Yeah, so I wrote, a couple years ago, I wrote The Orchard, which takes place in Putney, up by old Darrow's Orchard. That's about a young woman. She's in her mid-30s, and she's a legendary translator of Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry. So that's poetry that was written in 700, 800, 900. And she moves with her little daughter, Frith, who's, I guess, 7 at the very beginning of the book, to this sort of defunct orchard over on West Hill, and is translating and sort of getting away from her husband, who's having a rough time. And and so there's a lot of the poetry of Li Shui. She's famous for a book of poems that she translated by a woman poet who also had a young daughter, who also was self-exiled to the mountains in ancient China during the Tang Dynasty. And so there's a lot of Li Shui's poetry in the book, and Li Shui is fictional.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the poems, in translation, right? And it was really fun. And I think maybe my most proud moment was someone heard about the book at a reading, and came up to me and said, I am a Tang Dynasty translator, this woman. She was a professor at a university, and she said, it interests me. And I said, could I send you the manuscript? And she wrote back and said, these poems, they pass.
Wow.
They're wonderful.
Wow.
And I was
Yeah.
like, wow.
Phew, wow, me.
Yay, cool.
That's so great.
So to channel a woman poet from back then was pretty cool.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
And it brings together your poetry.
Yeah,
Piece as well. When is that coming out?
That is out. It's on Amazon as an ebook and an audiobook.
Oh.
And it's called The Orchard.
Green Mountain Orchard.
Right.
Which is close to a lot of our hearts.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Peter, thank you so much.
Oh, it's so great being here.
We could talk for a bit longer.
We could.
We could tell a few more stories.
We could talk all afternoon. We'll let these poor folks go to bed.
You'd have your own show. You'll have to come back to Vermont. We have the Peter Heller Show and keep us up to date on all the things that we're doing.
It's great being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Wendy.
I appreciate having you on. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody out there. An exciting afternoon with Peter Heller, and stay tuned for Peter and what he's not only publishing, but perhaps what we might be seeing on the screen as well. We will be back next week, and we will have someone else from the community on, and thanks for tuning in.